Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Adrienne Davidson Helgerson, and I'm the Director of Operations of the Davidson Institute. And I have here with me Dr. Tina Rochford. She is the Clinical Director of the Davidson Institute. We are a trauma therapy center in Vernon, BC, and we specialize in trauma-exposed professionals. Today's workshop is on healing trauma and cultivating healthy relationships. So the approach that we will be using today will be integrating attachment theory, Gottman Method, and somatic approaches to trauma-informed healing. So before we dive into it a little bit, I'll introduce myself and my background and let Dr. Rochford introduce herself as well. So I have a business background and I have been managing the clinic for a little over 6 years. And I am currently a master's student in counseling psychology. And Dr. Rochford, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. My background actually is in nursing, mental health nursing, which morphed into doing graduate work in psychology and eventually a PhD. And my research actually specialized in attachment. So we'll be diving into that a little bit more today. And it's obviously a topic that's near and dear to my heart, something I'm very interested in. Thank you, Adrienne.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first we'll just go over understanding trauma. What is it? What's the definition? What are the different types of trauma? And how does trauma really impact individuals and relationships?
Thanks, Adrienne. So I think I'll start out with defining trauma. So trauma occurs when we experience something very stressful, very frightening, that's extremely difficult to cope with, is out of our control. Now, most of us will experience a traumatic event in our lifetime. There are actually 3 different types of trauma. Acute trauma results from a single incident. So that might be something like a motor vehicle accident, a holdup at a bank, a convenience store, something like that, a one-off that will typically resolve over time, perhaps with some professional result, but will not have long-lasting consequences or sequelae. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged. So examples might be something like domestic violence or abuse. It's insidious. It goes on and on and on. We may not be really aware of it as we are with an acute thing. Complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often of an invasive interpersonal nature. So this would be complex trauma is the kind of thing that we see most often in our clinic. It could be combat trauma, it could be policing trauma, something that first responders, healthcare workers, people in those kinds of professions are extremely aware of and are exposed to constantly shift after shift. So what happens with trauma? It deeply challenges our sense of safety and security in the world and our confidence in the future. It changes the way we think about ourselves and others. The world does not feel safe. People do not feel safe. We don't necessarily trust the people we have in the past or people we may meet in the future. We're fearful of getting hurt. And then we turn it inward and we become angry at ourselves because we feel helpless to deal with this and over the loss of control in our lives. So often what we try and do, because we all have a need to control, to make meaning, we become aggressive and try to control others, which will just make us feel safer and in control. So this aggression is actually more a defense mechanism, and it's completely natural when we feel threatened. Trauma survivors may also feel intense shame, even guilt. We talk about the moral injury, feel unlovable or bad in the self-referencing way that I am bad. We're anxious, we're frightened, and really fear abandonment or rejection, which of course will really impact relationships with others. Trauma survivors typically describe that they feel cut off from here down. They're emotionally numb. They don't have sensations in their body. They're completely tuned out of emotions as well as the bodily sensations. As we're moving into talking about relationships, physical intimacy will be more difficult, if not impossible to have. And these kinds of feelings are confusing and frightening.
Thank you. So the first thing that we want to talk about in relationship to relationships is attachment theory. So we'll go over an overview of attachment theory, the different attachment styles, and how attachment styles affect relationships. So this comes from Bowlby's evolutionary theory of attachment, which suggests that children come into the world basically pre-programmed to form attachments with others. We're wired for connection because this essentially helps you survive. I mean, if you think about other animals, a lot of animals are born literally already able to walk and kind of sort of fend for themselves, but humans are born just completely helpless and reliant on their caregivers for, years of their lives. So that's completely unique to humans. So Bowlby suggests that there's a critical period for developing attachments, which is around 2.5 years. And if an attachment has not developed during this time period, then it may not happen at all. So he later proposed a more sensitive period of up to 5 years. So there's a little bit of discussion in this area about what the important years are, but essentially the first 5-6 years are very, very essential. So his hypothesis of maternal deprivation suggested that continual attachment disruption between the infant and the primary caregiver could result in long-term cognitive, social, and emotional difficulties for that infant. So according to Bowlby, an internal working model is a cognitive framework comprising mental representations for understanding the world, self, and others, and is based on the relationship with the primary caregiver. So it becomes really a prototype for all future relationships, social relationships, and allows individuals to predict, control, and manipulate interactions with others. So there's also a genetic component of this. And, there's some debate about this, but there's about 15 to 20% of the population has a more sensitive nervous system. You may hear these people referred to as HSPs, highly sensitive people. They're just more attuned to the subtleties in their environment and process that information much more deeply compared to others without this trait. So that is probably an evolutionary adaptation of being more vigilant about the environment. Maybe they were the watchers of the community. So it did have survival advantage, but it can also be overwhelming. Someone who's constantly aware of the subtleties of the environment and the people around them can really quickly experience sensory overload. And there's also some debate about, the genetics kind of loading the gun and environment pulling the trigger. So some, toxins in our environment and maybe even the maternal environment can possibly sensitize a person's nervous system as well. So it's a really, complicated, complex field that's always evolving with the research. So someone who is a highly sensitive person, they often report a more disorganized attachment style just because they're so sensitive to everything that even a normal event can feel just way too intense, too chaotic, too stimulating, just without enough respite to really feel safe and settled and secure. So in relationships, if you're a highly sensitive person, you might be unclear whether what you're feeling has origin in yourself or in your partner and what they're doing to create the situation. So they kind of have this sense of one foot on the gas and one foot on the brakes, and they want to be close to people, but being too close can really create this sensory assault that is really confusing and can dysregulate them for days. So there's also lots of overlap with CPTSD because the things that I just described are really, that can be the result of trauma as well. Do you want to go over the anxious preoccupied? Okay. All right. I'll cover all of the attachment style, even though that is her doctoral work. It is a special interest of mine as well. So the first attachment style that we'll go over is anxious preoccupied. And these are all really important to understand and cover when we're talking about trauma and relationships. Really helps us just understand people better. So an adult with an anxious attachment style tends to have a negative view of themselves and a more positive view of others. So you'll often hear these people describing their partner as their literal better half because they truly do believe that. They believe that they're less worthy of love in comparison to other people. And the thought of living without their partner or being alone in general can create so much anxiety. So there's a deep fear of abandonment here. So to ease the fear of abandonment, people with anxious attachment style really strongly desire security within relationships and attention and care and responsiveness from a partner. Tends to be the remedy for their feelings of anxiety. But on the other hand, the perceived absence of support and intimacy can lead someone with an anxious attachment style to become more clinging and demanding, preoccupied with the relationship and desperate for reassurance that they're loved. And if you've been in a relationship with this person, or maybe you are this person, you know that it can push people away pretty quickly. So, in a nutshell, people with this attachment style really value their relationships highly, but they're hypervigilant towards threats to their security. So maybe they'll be a little bit more, they'll be jealous, they'll be suspicious, just really hypervigilant. And also, if you're adding in a layer of trauma from your profession, for example, then there's the hypervigilance that comes from that, and that can really interplay with just the hypervigilance that someone who has an anxious or preoccupied attachment style will have. So they'll be worried that their loved one is not as invested in the relationship as they are. So the second attachment style is avoidant dismissive, and this is also commonly referred to as like a DA, dismissive avoidant. So people with this avoidant or dismissive attachment style tend to have a positive self-view and a negative view of others. So these people can be classified as narcissists frequently, which is a pathologizing term that is pretty common in this attachment style, which isn't always necessarily fair because these are people that have been hurt in their relationship to their caregiver. So they prefer to have a high sense of independence and self-sufficiency. And this is especially on an emotional level. So someone with an avoidant attachment style tends to believe that they don't have to be in a relationship with someone to feel complete. They don't want to depend on others. It's too risky to depend on others or seek support or approval. So they learned in childhood, in the first, formative years, that maybe their needs were not going to be met and they had to meet them themselves. And so they don't trust that other people can meet their needs. So they generally avoid intimacy or emotional closeness. They may withdraw from a relationship if they feel like the person is becoming too reliant on them in this manner. They'll hide or suppress their feelings when faced with a potentially emotionally dense situation such as conflict. So sometimes people with the DA attachment style can come in really strong. And then as soon as there's some demand for emotional closeness, they will withdraw. So that's a pretty common scenario. And often somebody who is a dismissive avoidant, they'll pair up with, someone who's anxious, preoccupied, and then it just creates this really unhealthy loop.
Just wanted to add that a common sort of colloquial expression might be the lone wolf personality type here. So these people do not necessarily abhor connection with others. They want connection, but essentially on their own terms. As Adrian mentioned, dismissive avoidant types have learned to function primarily on their own and seek out attachment, but if it becomes too close, then they push away. It's kind of an approach avoidance type. Can be very confusing for everybody concerned.
Yes, and of course there's degrees of this. There's somebody who is really not, their needs were really not met at all will be like hyper independent, whereas if it was less severe, they might just be pretty independent but still be able to accept help and emotional closeness from others. So the third type is disorganized or fearful avoidant. And these people tend to vacillate between traits of anxious and avoidant, really depending on their mood and circumstances. So it's confusing to others because it's ambiguous, their behaviors are ambiguous. So for adults with this attachment style, the partner and the relationship themselves are often the source of both desire and fear. Because on one hand, they do want intimacy and closeness, kind of like the dismissive avoidant. But on the other hand, they've experienced troubles with trusting others and depending on others. So there's this vacillation that happens. They often struggle with identifying and regulating their emotions and tend to avoid strong emotional attachment due to their intense fear of getting hurt. So this is often, a child that comes from a family that there's a lot of emotional abuse and not a lot of emotional regulation. There's a lot of unhealthy emotions being expressed, and sometimes the child is the subject of anger or maybe overwhelming a mother who is crying a lot, or angry father, and all of these things that lead into a disorganized attachment style. And then the one that does not get enough attention is a secure attachment, of course. So the first three styles covered, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, are insecure attachment styles. So they're characterized by difficulties with cultivating and maintaining healthy relationships. And in contrast, the secure attachment style implies that a person is comfortable expressing their emotions openly, and they can depend on their partners and allow their partners to depend on them. So relationships with somebody who has a secure attachment are based on honesty, tolerance, and emotional closeness. And although someone with this attachment style often thrives in their relationship, they also don't fear being on their own. Secure attachers tend to have a positive view of themselves and others. So they don't seek external approval overly or validation. They can successfully identify and regulate their own emotions and even help a partner do so with theirs. And so next, we want to just talk about emotionally safe people, because attachment styles, insecure attachment styles, are often when you grow up with an emotionally unsafe person for whatever the reason is. Just with all the tension in autism, you think of, what is autism? It's sometimes not understanding social cues and emotions of others. So there's lots of people out there that are walking around with undiagnosed autism, that just think that they're a little bit quirky, and the result of maybe having a parent who is that quirky, probably on the spectrum person, is likely misattunement, which was chronic in childhood. That can result in itself in insecure attachment, and it's no fault of anyone's. It's just really not identifying what's going on for you and resolving it so it doesn't impact others. And we often don't resolve what's going on with us before having children because life is really challenging. So these are all really common things, but it's really important to learn what is an emotionally safe person, because we heal in relation, and a lot of this that we talk about is relational trauma. That's really the most common and really just troubling type of trauma that we see. So emotionally safe people can help you regulate your immune system, or your nervous system, sorry. And everyone really needs safe connections for co-regulation. So, think of who in your life makes you feel safe. Who creates a safe space for your thoughts and your feelings. And that safety is really felt in their presence and their body language and energy. And these relationships can really help regulate your immune system also through co-regulation. So co-regulation happens when another person sees and hears your feelings and experience, and this allows you to feel comfortable. And a lot of people don't even know what this feels like, and when they are around an emotionally safe person, it feels almost wrong. It feels weird. It feels uncomfortable. So it takes some awareness of what is an emotionally safe person and what does it feel like, because if you've grown up in a state of just chronic, just chaos, that's going to feel normal to you. Emotionally safe people are going to feel foreign and unknown and maybe dangerous, right? So if you don't have a person in your life that you would call emotionally safe, obviously that's okay. But can you search for other ways to regulate your nervous system? Can you spend time with pets? Can you be in nature, take a bath? You can engage in some self-care activities while working on increasing your support system to include safe and supportive people. And we were actually talking earlier this morning just about, people and their desire to withdraw and be in isolation, and like trying to figure out, do people need to, is there a place for isolation, or do you really have to be in the context of safe relationships, whether that's with a therapist or a good friend or an intimate partner, to really truly heal? And I think we came to the conclusion that there is a time and place for being in isolation, spending some time reflecting, maybe reading books and doing some self-discovery. But also, if you tend to withdraw from people in your life whenever you're going through something, then maybe it could potentially be that your body, your nervous system recognizes that you don't have safe people in your life. So that's what you do. You would withdraw from those people. So it's an interesting discussion, but definitely one to look into for yourself.
Yeah, just to ladder on to that, as we were talking about that, and as reflecting on life experience and clinical experience, I do often hear from traumatized people, I need to go away, I need to be alone, I want to go live in a van by the river. Literally, these are comments I've heard recently. I need to be alone, I need to isolate. And this kind of sort of works until it doesn't, because when one's traumatized, there's a natural tendency to shut oneself off from all stimuli and people. So there's nothing that's going to be triggering, but I'm not sure, that, as we've said before, does time heal all wounds? Does time alone heal all wounds? I don't really think so. I think we heal in relation to other people. I think we heal in relation to our environment. And I know in our program, we find a lot of the healing happens within the context of the group. Although we have individual counseling and activities and so on, the group really tends to be the most healing element. So I think, given that as humans, we're wired for connection, we tend to live in community. I think it's important to be aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, relationships can be tricky, right? Because what humans do to one another is they hold up a mirror to you and to your actions, and sometimes they reflect things that you're not really ready to address yet. And so it's easier to be alone. It's easier to shut everybody out and just do whatever you want, because there's zero feedback around you. But feedback is what ultimately helps you grow and develop and be the best version of yourself that you can be, and also contribute to others, because you have gifts, right? And if you just isolate yourself in a bunker of self-development and just focus on yourself, then the world is really missing you. So it's important. So we'll cover the Gottman Method now, which I'll hand over to Dr. Rochford. This is kind of her thing. She's a Gottman trained therapist as well.
Yeah, so just a word about the Gottmans, for those of you who haven't heard of them. They did some seminal work in terms of couples counseling in the 60s, 70s, and they studied something like 3,000 couples. It was a longitudinal study. They had something called the Love Lab in Seattle, and they had all these couples living in the Love Labs for a weekend, actually, in the cameras and all the different gadgets measuring galvanic skin response, blood pressure, heart rate, all those kinds of things were going from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So they collected enormous amounts of data, which were then coded and interpreted by these graduate students. Had a lot of work to do. They also would stage a conflict situation, and just to see physiologically and visually what the response is, what would happen with couples when they were placed in a situation. So just a quick summary, the Coles Notes version, what they came up with was what makes couples, what makes relationships work, and what are the predictors of divorce. The main thing they found, it wasn't arguments about money, it wasn't arguments about children, it was not arguments about intimacy. it was basically the way couples handled conflict and conflict disagreements. That occurs in all relationships. And the vast majority of it, 2/3 of it, are what we call perpetual issues, things that are going to bubble up. They don't have an actual resolution. And it really is how we manage the conflict that is the key. Not do we solve them, don't we solve them. So for some examples of perpetual issues might be maybe one person's an introvert, the other's an extrovert. Maybe one is a spender, the other's a saver. Maybe one is incredibly tidy, the other one not so much. So are these ever going to go away? Probably not totally. It's how people deal with them when they come up that is the key. So that was pretty interesting. So that was a key piece that the Gottmans found. And observing these couples in the Love Lab, they could predict fairly quickly which couples would be together in a decade and which would not, with something like, I think, 80 to 90% accuracy. Was really quite phenomenal. And now another piece that the Gottmans came up with were 4 horsemen, which sounds apocalyptic, and it's actually called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Now these are things which will really tank a relationship, and they are criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. So for example, if I criticize you, that finger pointing thing, how are you going to respond? You're going to be defensive, right? You're going to dig your heels in, you want to protect yourself. And then if the criticism gets even deeper and turns into contempt, which is name calling, really nasty stuff. We all know what contempt looks like, feels like, not good. It lands on us in a really negative kind of way. Even the term dripping with contempt, that kind of thing is really unpleasant. So if this cycle goes on and on and on, eventually it's going to lead to what Gottman calls stonewalling, which is basically when one shuts down emotionally, physiologically. In other words, I can't take anymore. I'm going to check out. I'm not going to listen to it. I literally can't hear it anymore. And I may, in fact, just walk away and leave. So the way I conceptualize it, one horseman leads to the other, leads to the other, leads to the other, which is stonewalling. And there are different kinds of strategies, or what we call antidotes, to address these, the 4 horsemen, because they really are negative kinds of things. What are the principles of a healthy relationship? So, it's not that long ago, maybe 100 years ago or so, that we married. Is sort of post-industrial evolution. We got together and we married and we had children and we worked. And then around 45 to 50, we died. And that was the lifespan. So we didn't expect a whole lot of marriage, nor did we live that long. So we really didn't get into, I guess, these higher order needs, as it were. Things have changed. We're expecting more from relationships now. As women, I think our mean lifespan is mid-80s. Men is a few less years. So that's an extra 40, 45 years or so in relationships. And things change, and eventually couples are left on their own. So again, expecting more from marriage and or relationships presents some different kinds of challenges. So one of the things that Gottman suggests is, do set the bar high. You will be treated probably how you expect to be treated. Don't set the bar really low, because that's probably what you're going to get. Set the bar high in terms of respect, support, appreciation, things like that. Another key piece is what he calls positive sentiment override. Simply means more positive interactions to any negative interactions in terms of words, deeds, gestures. And there's a magic ratio. I think it's 5 to 1. So 5 positive things, say we can say in the course of a day, to 1 negative. Now, to do that, one needs to be intentional about it. So, we often might see our partners doing something that I really appreciate that, or that, that's really landing on me nicely, but we don't say anything. So it's being intentional about noticing and expressing these 5 things that you appreciate, that you notice they're positive. In a sense, it's analogous to when we discipline children. Really easy to catch them being bad. How about catch them when they're good and notice the positive things, because then we're probably going to get more of that. That's another key piece of healthy relationships, a positive sentiment override. And he's actually constructed what he calls the sound he and his wife Julie, John and Julie, the sound relationship house. Pillars are trust and commitment. And the bottom is something called, he calls it love maps. To me, it is friendship. How well do you know your partner, their best friend, their dreams, their fears, their favorite foods, colors, things like that. And there's a lot of sort of games and things one can do just to increase your friendship, doing things together. And then that's followed by expressing fondness and admiration, words of appreciation, gestures, leave taking, things like that. How do you celebrate anniversaries, special occasions, dinners? Turning towards your partner as opposed to against your partner. So when something good happens or something difficult happens, is your partner your first go-to, the person that you would connect with on your phone or whatever, as opposed to maybe your best friend or somebody at work? Is your partner, I really want to share that with my partner. So it's turning away can be a bit of a slippery slope. And we see that increasingly with technology and what we call emotional affairs, if you will. So maybe practice turning towards your partner, the good, bad, the ugly. Ideally, your partner should be your go-to person, the person who has your back, the person who sees you, the person who hears you. So those are just as a bit of an overview of some of the Gottman kinds of strategies.
Yeah, and I think like if there's positive sentiment override in your relationship and there's abundance of positivity and not as much criticism or anything, then you will naturally, I think, turn towards. So it works really well together, I think.
Okay, and Gottman has identified the Gottmans, 5 things to look for and cultivate. Honesty. That seems fairly straightforward, but don't trust someone who lies to you. And honesty about the big things, of course, but also about the small things. Just practice telling the truth. Sometimes I say with couples who, they've white lies and things like that, just imagine as you're going about your life, your partner, whatever you're doing, your daily interactions, your phone, whatever you're doing, your partner's just kind of hanging around it over your shoulder. Do you feel comfortable with your behavior, what you're doing, what you're saying? Just as a bit of a check on just your behavior, what you're saying, what you're doing. And that maybe it's a little bit black and white, but that seems to clear up any of these kind of gray areas in terms of, is this okay? Is that okay? Transparency. Are you an open book? Does your partner invite you to join their life, their family, their friends, their activities? And it's not about having to report in on everything that you do, but just sharing your life with your partner because you want them to be part of it. There's a difference between secrecy and privacy. Of course, we all have some things we're private about, but being secretive does not augur well for a strong, lasting relationship. Accountability. Your partner keep their promises. Picking up some milk on the way home, picking up the kids, remembering a date night, remembering your birthday, whatever it might be. Just really practice keeping your commitments. That goes a long way. Actions speak louder than words. Talk's cheap. Ethical actions. Are you detecting anything that's maybe slightly immoral or just doesn't quite fit with your moral code? Red flag. So if that just doesn't sit well with you, probably best you could bring it up, or maybe you need to move on. Maybe this just isn't the person for you. Proof of alliance. Do they take your needs into account, or do they act only in their own self-interest? If your partner demonstrates they've got your back, even in small ways, that's a great sign. Can I run you a bath? You've had a long day. Can I bring you a glass of wine? What can I do to help you feel better, to make your life a little brighter?
Yeah, thank you for that. The Gottmans, I mean, when did they start their love lab?
In the 60s and 70s, actually.
Yeah.
And it's a longitudinal study, but they continue to do research and publish. And their work is what I really like. It's incorporating some of the newer models of relationship theory, such as attachment. And John Gottman, I think he's closing in on 90 actually, and he's still lecturing and educating and publishing and researching. So they're in it for life, and they certainly their theories are developing and evolving as we learn more, as we research more.
Yeah, interesting. They're definitely very relevant today still. So the next thing that we wanted to cover is more in terms of trauma and the relationship and how relationships can kind of re-traumatize people. So just things to kind of be aware of if you're in a relationship with someone has a trauma background. So relationship, there's power, control, subversiveness, not being seen or heard, violating trust, failure to ensure emotional safety, a relationship that doesn't feel collaborative or it just isn't collaborative, doing things for rather than with, and use of punitive treatment, coercive practices, and oppressive language. So we'd like to cover the 6 principles of trauma-informed care because that really governs what we do in the clinic, and in the helping professions, it's essential. So they were developed by SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, and we'll go through them. There's 6 of them. The first one is safety, mental, physical, emotional. The next, number 2, is trustworthiness and transparency. 3rd is peer support. 4 is collaboration and mutuality. 5 is empowerment, voice, and choice. 6 is cultural, historical, and gender-specific issues. So we will go through them. There's about 6 slides. Do you want to alternate?
Sure.
Okay.
So the first one that Adrian listed was safety. Safety is, we need to feel physically and emotionally safe. It's absolutely paramount. It's the number one thing. So creating an environment where we feel protected and comforted by the presence of someone else. And as Adrian was alluding to, sometimes, ideally, we have those people in our lives with whom we feel safe. They can hold space for us. And if we don't have those people, then we need to find people like that. And for example, and I can talk about in our group programs that we create a very safe, comfortable environment. We make sure everybody's seated where they feel comfortable. We lock the doors so there aren't going to be interruptions, because that kind of thing makes people feel unsafe, people who are in a state of hypervigilance. And we really monitor the group dynamics, kind of who's who in the group and how people's different roles emerge. When we feel safe, then and it doesn't happen overnight. We talk about stages of the group development. When we feel safe, then gradually we can become a little bit more open, a little bit more vulnerable, and therein lies the power of healing. So every relationship should prioritize safety, especially those relationships that are intended to last a lifetime.
Continuation of safety, if you so want to do this.
Okay. Open communication. Again, I'm thinking of the groups that we have, and over time, as the group evolves, people feel communicate more and more. Of course, some people are more quiet, some are talkers, some are listeners, but we really try and encourage space for people to communicate openly. Boundaries, whether in the groups that we run or in an interpersonal relationship, it's important to have boundaries. Some things are simply not okay, and we establish what those are, and so that we each know what's okay and what, no, you're crossing a boundary there, I'm not comfortable with that. Trust. Again, the things I alluded to earlier on, keep your promises, be consistent, be reliable. And then we have a foundation of trust. Mean what you say what you mean. Validating emotions. So listening, you may not agree, but emotions just are. They don't have a value judgment. They're not right or wrong, good or bad. So listen to what the other person is saying. validate, show empathy, show understanding. You may not totally understand. You probably don't, but just listen, just hold space. That's all you need to do. Refrain from being harmful. And I don't just mean physical harm, but, watch your words, watch your responses. Be really careful with humor. I know sometimes people default to, for example, sarcasm, which I personally think is not only a tricky form of humor, I think it's kind of an abusive form of humor. So don't go there. It can be extremely hurtful, and you completely blow out that whole sense of safety that you've ideally worked so hard to cultivate. Respect. Treat each other with respect, with dignity. Value each other's opinions, beliefs, differences. Tell me more about that. That's interesting, even if it's different. I'd like to understand, learn more about you. When you have conflict, disagreement, of course you will. You're two human beings with different life experiences. Address it. What I talk about is third order problem solving. So there's you, me, and I have my ideas, you have your ideas. Why don't we externalize it? The issue, the decision, whatever, put it out there. Let's brainstorm between the two of us. We'll probably come up with a solution that's richer and possibly something really different than either myself or you could have come up with on our own. It's called collaborative problem solving. There's certainly times for other kinds of problem solving methods, when you need to make a snap judgment, but many things, try and work in them collaboratively. A team, two's better than one. Autonomy, support each other's hobbies, interests, friends, and respect each other's need for independence, and that in turn nourishes the connection between you. If you need professional support, it's there. Seek it. I think it takes strength and courage and a growth mindset. Do that. Professionals are out there to guide you and to help you, and it's typically good things can come from that.
Thank you. So the next principle of trauma-informed care, which is highly relevant in relationships as well, is trust. After you've experienced a trauma or, lots of trauma or just a, traumatic childhood, it's hard to trust. It's hard to trust the intentions and actions of others. Because it's likely that somebody has shown you that they were not safe to be trusted, even if they were in a position to be trusted, like a parent or a teacher or a coach or something like that. So trustworthiness and transparency just involve building trust through honest communication, consistency, and reliability. In a relationship with someone who's a trauma survivor, partners can demonstrate trustworthiness by being truthful, dependable, and accountable, just like Dr. Rochford just covered. There's a lot of overlap here, but just, follow through with commitments, respect the other person's privacy, and be open to discussing their concerns and feelings. Establishing trust is just so essential for creating that secure attachment with your partner, and fostering a sense of safety and predictability for the survivor. If you really want to get the best out of that person, then you have a significant part to play in that. Especially if there's children involved, it's super important to support that person. So, boundaries can be often an issue for adult survivors of trauma. Often people who are too trusting, and as a consequence, maybe have poor boundaries, put themselves at risk of reenacting the trauma of their youth, because, there are predators out there that will hurt people who have poor boundaries. And so when we talk about boundaries, that's a really important thing to have. And it's not just this kind of like self-interested, like, no, I don't want to do that. It's really to protect yourself and to demonstrate what a healthy boundary looks like to others, especially children, because that's how they can protect themselves from being taken advantage of by someone who's predatory. So super important stuff. Just to break the cycle of abuse by, starting to learn how to be assertive and to know what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. That's a really essential part.
Peer support. Um, Peer support emphasizes the importance of connection, community, and healing with trauma. We find this so often in our groups. The trauma survivors themselves, again, the power of the group, they say, is probably the most important part. Similar when the spouses come, we have a spousal component, and often the spouses have felt very isolated and have been in a caretaking role, essentially, and the connection is extremely powerful and extremely healing. So in relationships, peer support, it can come from one's partner, from friends, from family members, or support groups who understand and validate the survivor's experiences. Our particular groups, we have military and RCMP. The language is similar, the experiences are similar, and they really resonate with each other's experiences. So partners can, it's tough for partners because they maybe have not been, for example, traumatized. They haven't been in the military, they haven't been first responders, but they can offer empathy, validation, and companionship, and help to reduce the sense of isolation.
Yeah, I think a peer support is so important, coming from like a peer who has experienced trauma, similar or just, to what you've experienced, or just in general, someone who's been through things, because it really shows like a model of the possibilities that healing is possible, and just the lived experience is just something that, someone with just purely an academic background will never be able to fully understand. So combining peer support with, professionally trained people, in the healing capacity, it really, I think, is just the absolute sweet spot. So, collaboration and mutuality. We believe healing happens in relationships. We're relational beings as humans. And we often say that harm that has happened in relationships needs to be healed within relationships. And like we said before, a lot of trauma is relational trauma. So it's humans kind of hurting each other, unhealed people hurting other people, and then those people becoming hurt, and then the cycle just continuating. And that's what we call, generational trauma as well. And I think that we all have varying degrees of generational trauma. We talk a lot about Indigenous communities here in Canada, and with the colonization and the residential schools and all the trauma that happened in their culture. But in other cultures, there are other things that were traumatic, going to war, and World War II, and, undiagnosed PTSD showing up in the family, and that, there's just a lot. If you really dig into your family history, humans do suffer a lot. So, compassion is essential. But when we talk about the fourth principle of trauma-informed care, it's called collaboration and mutuality. It's just meaning like healing doesn't really happen in isolation, and how we define relationships in this context will be different for each of us. So collaboration and mutuality involve partnering with survivors in their healing journey, respecting their autonomy, valuing their perspectives. In relationships, this means approaching the survivor as an equal partner and involving them in the decision-making process. Partners can collaborate with survivors by asking for their input, respecting their choices, and supporting their goals and preferences, just to create a sense of empowerment and agency, promoting autonomy and self-efficacy for the survivor, because trauma just really strips you of power. So empowerment is just really one of the first steps, along with, safety. So sharing power and decision-making is really important in a relationship with someone, especially with someone who has a trauma experience or background, because for a trauma survivor, when decisions have been made about you, without you, they may have resulted in harm or trauma. So being involved, having a voice, having a choice, all very important. And that kind of leads into the next principle.
Yeah, and just an add-on to what Adrian was saying, I know we really emphasize with the people we work with that it's a shared journey. It's not top-down. We have some knowledge we can help you with, but so much more than we do, and we will walk this path together.
The client is the expert in their own lives.
Okay, empowerment, voice, and choice. So really important, because one of the really sad things that happens with trauma is that we lose our sense of hope, and we feel helpless. It's very real. With trauma, you can't just think your way out of it, talk your way out of it, act your way out of it, because the brain is altered, that we've talked about before. Prefrontal cortex is altered in terms of interpreting stimuli coming in. The amygdala, in terms of deciding if things are alarming or not, isn't working. It's shrunken. The hippocampus, where memory is stored with appropriate emotional attachments, that is all dysfunctional. So it's impacted our brain and our system and how we respond. We really can't help it. This is something physiological that's happened to us. So our behavior, it's not because we're crazy or broken or irreconcilably different, but we're having a normal response to abnormal situations in trauma and in the triggers post-trauma that we experience in everyday life. What is abnormal is pain, betrayal, and shame and abuse. So given the whole notion of neuroplasticity, in terms of our brains, they're not fixed at 5, they're not fixed at 10, or we used to think they were fixed at 25. They're not. There's neuroplasticity. We can alter our brains throughout our life. We can learn to regulate our emotions. We can learn new mental health habits, and trauma can be released from our bodies. Bessel van der Kolk, the seminal work on trauma, that the body keeps score. I had a referral the other day from somebody from the Vietnam War. So this person was now in his 70s, and it'd been over 50 years. He never sought help, and he intends to come to one of our programs. And the oldest referral we had was actually somebody from the Korean War. So I think he was in his 80s. So there's also something we call post-traumatic growth. So what is this? So this means surviving trauma, moving beyond trauma, and we can actually create a new life story. That narrative will always be with us, but we can sort of move from survivors to thrivers. We can, and often that comes through healing our own trauma, healing our relationships, and perhaps helping others, contributing to our communities, contributing to the larger world, is a big piece in post-traumatic growth. And breaking free from the silence, which many people carry. The two gentlemen I just alluded to have been carrying this for 50, 60 odd years, never talking about it, never seeking help. And the lack of power and control we experienced during the trauma, and that continued to cast us as victims, particularly the two that I just referred to, have been living this for decades and decades. Survivor wisdom. We can use our stories to bring to life the experience, and to illustrate things for others, survivors, supporters, and service professionals. And we can be real examples of resilience and how that shows up in our lives. We have compassion and insight, and that we've acquired at great cost. It's not available in the book. The people we work with and have been working with for 10 years in our clinic, and decades prior to that, and in my private work, are some of the most compassionate, competent, truly wonderful people I've ever met in my life. They inspire me day in, day out. There's so much to learn from them. But unfortunately, because they have been hurt, their voices are shut down, and they're not showing up in the world as they will. I'm always hopeful about that. Survivor perspective. We're not the sum of our deficits. We're actually brave, incredibly brave, adaptive people. by any definition, we are resilient, or we would not be here. Some of these things people experience are so hard and so challenging. I can't imagine ever putting myself in those kinds of situations, but they do hard things to protect us and protect our society, and have absolutely my utmost respect. So by othering us, you add to the shame and stigma. So even the term trauma-informed care suggests that professionals have resources to help, and we have none, we meaning survivors. If professionals advocate for us, instead of empowering us and elevate our voices, understand that once again, we suffer the loss of power and control we experienced during trauma. Again, this is the collaborative journey we're talking about. We were recently in Ottawa, actually. We were asked to participate in a panel on women in the military. What was really lovely, we were there, but we were on a panel with women veterans, and there were a lot of veterans behind us, and they had an opportunity to speak, and their stories were the most powerful. Those are the stories that needed to be heard. It was truly a very memorable experience, one I'll remember for the rest of my life.
So the sixth principle of trauma-informed care is cultural, historical, and gender issues. Gender, cultural, and historical or generational experiences influence the experience and perception of trauma. Societal expectations, power dynamics, and cultural norms associated with these factors can contribute to the diverse types and intensities of trauma. So this principle really recognizes that trauma is intersectional. And there's an impact of culture, of history, and gender-related factors on individuals' experiences. So in relationships, partners can demonstrate cultural competence by respecting, honoring the survivor's cultural background, beliefs, and values. They can also be mindful of the historical and societal context of trauma, such as, systemic oppression or discrimination, and its influence on the survivor's experiences. So, in our experience, we work with women veterans, and it's pretty difficult to address the trauma and institutional trauma, betrayal trauma that they have from being hurt in the military in a very masculine context without acknowledging that there is a history, there are cultural factors at play that shape the culture, the subculture of the military into something that has historically been oppressive and discriminatory towards women. So you really have to address all of the factors of, we call it biopsychosocial, spiritual, there's biological factors, psychological factors, social factors, cultural factors, and of course, spiritual factors. So really important to have a holistic view to be really trauma informed. So having sensitivity to gender issues like power dynamics and gender-based violence is essential for creating a really supportive and inclusive environment for all survivors. Some examples of that would include women, facing higher rates of sexual assault and domestic violence, leading to trauma associated with those experiences. We actually were tasked with creating a women's program for military veterans some years ago because women, it was becoming, epidemic in the military for sexual abuse to occur. There's lots of factors why, but having the culture itself was is designed in a way that just facilitates abuses to happen. So then we add women in and we don't change the structure of things, and women get hurt. So I think it's important to acknowledge these things, and even though there's some political context around it, that does not help the situation a lot of the time. So there's different cultural perceptions and expectations on speaking about or addressing traumatic experience. There's racially motivated violence. There's, hate crimes, or what we see a lot is, police brutality. We work with a lot of retired RCMP, and and that you could, you know, define that as racially motivated violence. So there's systemic racism, there's prejudice, there's other acts of hate. You know, being in the world is not, the world has a lot of beauty in it, but there's also a lot of just real things that cause harm to people that we would be ignorant to ignore. So, you know, historical trauma resulting from the collective experiences of racism, resulting from, you know, intergenerational trauma, such as, you know, the indigenous people, and, you know, passed down through generations, like, you know, slavery, colonization, genocide, and forced displacement. So generational trauma, there's, you know, historical events and systemic injustices that create these long-lasting trauma that affects individuals and communities across generations. Generational trauma refers to the transmission of the psychological and emotional effects of trauma from one generation to the next, meaning that trauma experienced by an individual or group can have really long-lasting impacts that persist beyond the immediate victims, and, you know, can be passed down to subsequent generations. You know, like we're seeing with the Indigenous people in Canada after, you know, all of the residential schools and trauma that we, and oppression and discrimination that we subjected these people groups to, a lot of this unaddressed trauma, you know, results in people looking for ways to cope and turning to alcohol and really disrupting the communities and causing, you know, just so many wounds, and that just keep on getting passed down. So thankfully they're starting to kind of address that and support those communities. It can be, you know, generational trauma can be transmitted through various mechanisms: direct exposure to traumatic events, experienced by parents or caregivers, disrupted attachment relationships, the influence of cultural and familial narratives or stories, and societal factors that really perpetuate systemic injustice. Much like overall trauma, generational trauma can manifest in diverse ways, including heightened stress responses, anxiety, depression, addiction, difficulties with emotional regulation, relationship challenges, and cultural or identity struggles. And something that's really interesting to us is a clinic who really focuses on the biological and somatic factors of trauma as well, is that there is research to suggest that trauma does leave epigenetic marks, which is chemical modifications on DNA. So this can influence gene expression. So that means that, you know, these changes can be inherited across generations and potentially predispose individuals to psychological and physiological vulnerabilities associated from trauma. So really important stuff. If you heal yourself, you're really healing kind of potentially healing your family line. So we wanted to just finish with a few book recommendations. Maybe we can just alternate going through these. So the first one is one that I like. It's from by Dr. Nicole LaPerla. So she is known as the holistic psychologist on Instagram, social media. She has a really integrative, holistic approach to psychology, attracted international audience. Millions of people are following her work as a path to healing relationships. So she harnesses the latest scientific research and teaches us how to recognize how our unmet needs from our earliest relationships create our current dysfunctional relationship patterns and leave us in a constant internal threat, even with those closest to us. So the book is called How to Be the Love You Seek by Dr. Nicole LaPerla.
Next book is called Attached, and it guides readers in determining what our personal attachment styles are, which is pretty interesting, and also in terms of who we might attract in a mate, and offers a roadmap for building stronger, more fulfilling connections with the people that we love.
Yeah, so that book is by Amir Levine, I believe, and Rachel Heller. The font is very small, but a really good book to understand more about your attachment style and how that might show up in your relationship. Healing Together is one that would be maybe more specific for first responders and veterans. It's kind of just addresses more like trauma related to operational duties, and how you can use the book Healing Together to recover from trauma and help their partner recover. By understanding the impact of trauma, learning to communicate their needs, managing anger, dealing with traumatic memories, recapturing lost intimacy, and recognizing their resiliency as a couple. So that is called Healing Together, and that is by Susan B. Phillips.
Okay. The last one is complex PTSD, from surviving to thriving. Focuses on complex PTSD, complex meaning many occurrences, often in the line of duties over one's lifetime, which often results from prolonged trauma, such as childhood abuse or neglect, as well as operational stress injuries. Discusses how complex trauma can affect relationships and offers practical tools for healing and self-care. Being in a relationship with somebody with severe trauma is extremely challenging, and many relationships do not survive. And that's why we include a couples component in our program. And we also offer a couples week at least once a year, recognizing that you have the two individuals in a relationship, and then there's a third party, the trauma, the PTSD. And, the two of you need to work to externalize it and work together, or you're going to be butting up against trauma all the time. There's going to be hurt, there's going to be anger, loss of intimacy, lack of connection, resentment, guilt, exhaustion on the part of everybody. And neither party means to hurt the other. But PTSD is almost like it takes on a life of its own. So ideally, books like this and programs like our couples program, where we externalize it, understand it, read about it, learn about it, how best to support each other on this journey. Really important.
So I guess the final question, which we hear a lot, that I would love to ask you is, from the perspective of a client, am I too traumatized to be in a relationship? Can you be too traumatized to be in a relationship?
Okay. I just think of the AA folks that say, before you get into a relationship, practice keeping a plant alive for a year.
Not the right answer.
No, it's an answer from about 40, 50 years ago, old Bill and Bob. But really good. It is challenging for sure. And often people get together and, again, these are people who have suffered trauma are some of the best people I've ever met. So it's not like trauma defines you and it is your entire self-concept. There's many other attributes that make up a person. And, of course, a potential partner could be drawn to this person only to realize, well, this PTSD is a lot. The anger, the isolation, the depression, the emotional dysregulation, the approach, avoidance things, it's a lot for a partner to deal with. And so many relationships don't make it. Our goal is to help relationships make it, because it impacts everybody, the spouse, the family, all the other relationships. They're really important. So I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've had people in our program who've been together for 40 odd years, and together they've weathered the ups and downs of trauma as a couple, and often with some professional support, some commitment, and so on. Not an easy journey, but I think it's possible. A perfect relationship, of course, is if you're each have had wonderful childhoods, your attachment styles are very secure, you're showing up as your best self consistently. But I don't know too many of us who are that perfect. So, Adrienne, yes. What do you think?
Yeah, I think healing is possible. I think it really all has to do with your openness and your goals. Yeah, I think definitely if if you both have the same goal and you have resources to reach those goals, and whether that's internal or external resources, support available, just a friend who can guide you to the right books or whatever, it doesn't have to cost money. I think, yeah, if you're intentional about it and you are motivated, then absolutely, that's the best place to heal from trauma. So I think you have to take the first step of really being compassionate to yourself and choosing yourself, and really knowing your why and working on your narrative. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. This was an interesting conversation. Thank you, Dr. Rochford, for your collaboration.
Thank you, Adrian. And thank you to you, our listeners. And we look forward to further podcasts, this nature touching on other topics to do with trauma. Thank you again.
Okay. Thank you.